Hello and welcome back. In this particular lecture we're going to take care of talking about the urinary system. The urinary system is a very sophisticated and complex system. It's very vital to the functioning of the human body. You may have not had a lot of experience with the urinary system, so some parts of this may seem difficult to you, but you can always rewind and look at parts that may seem a little bit more challenging. The urinary system does consist of two kidneys. Some people do have three kidneys. Some people have one kidney. You can live with one kidney. These particular organs, the job of these particular organs is to filter the blood and to maintain the composition of blood. We'll talk more about what kidneys do in just a minute. You also have two ureters. These convey urine to the urinary bladder. So these ureters come out of the kidneys and they go to the urinary bladder. We do have one urinary bladder which stores urine, and then we also have one urethra which conveys the waste substances that are filtered out of the blood by the kidneys. It filters these substances and then conveys them to the urinary bladder. The urethra takes all these substances to the outside of the body. This is kind of what it looks like if you take and remove all the digestive organs and kind of look inside of the body. You can see that the right kidney is just a little bit lower or a little bit more inferior to the left kidney. That's so that the liver can fit in to its space that it needs to fit into. You can see that they're not super huge organs, but they really are really super important organs. Just to kind of show you a little bit of the blood supply, but we'll talk more about it later, we do have the abdominal aorta right here, and branching off the abdominal aorta are your renal arteries, which are going to carry blood to the kidneys. Coming out of the kidneys will be the renal veins, and they will go to the inferior vena cava to take blood back to the heart. So the job of the urinary system is many. So regulation of blood ionic composition, so our regulation of sodium and potassium and chloride and calcium, all of these things are controlled by the kidneys. We also regulate the blood pH, so how much hydrogen ions and how much bicarbonate is in the blood is regulated by the urinary system. So regulation of blood volume, how much water you have in the blood. Regulation of blood pressure. It's also a job of the urinary system. So the kidneys do produce a hormone called renin, which will help to alter blood pressure. Maintenance of blood osmolarity. So how much dissolved solutes you have in your blood is maintained by the urinary system. It even produces hormones like erythropoietin. So the kidneys can sense when there's low oxygen levels in the blood, and they produce erythropoietin, which will go to the red bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. So it also produces calcitriol, which is the active form of vitamin D, and that's going to help aid you in helping to absorb, helps your small intestine to absorb calcium into the bloodstream. So regulation of blood glucose levels also happens not only in the liver but also in the urinary system, specifically the kidneys. So there are parts of the kidneys or cells in the kidneys that can take glutamine, and which is an amino acid, and make sugar out of it in the process called gluconeogenesis. The liver does a very similar function. In case you need sugar, the kidneys are there to help you out. And then excretion of wastes and foreign substances is a major job of the urinary system. Now, this is just a few things that the urinary system does. You can have a whole class in just kidneys, because that's how complicated and how many jobs they perform. All right, so we're going to talk about the kidney first, and then we'll go through and talk about other parts of the urinary system. So the kidney is a reddish-brown bean-shaped organ. It's not the size of a bean. It's much bigger than a bean. It's about 12 centimeters long, and it's enclosed in a tough fibrous capsule. So it's almost like a skin-like connective tissue covering over the whole organ that we call the kidney. There's also, if you look at beyond the fibrous capsule, there will be fat tissue that packs around the organ, and then there also will be various kinds of connective tissues that anchor the organ into the abdominal cavity, around the surrounding parts in the abdominal cavity. So when you're running, the kidneys aren't slamming up against your abdominal cavity, but they're held in place by all this fat, this adipose tissue, and these other connective tissues. So the kidneys are positioned what we call retroperitoneally. That means they're behind the peritoneal membrane, and they're on either side of the vertebral column, and they're between the 12th thoracic and 3rd lumbar vertebrae. And you can see right here in this location where they're located. So you can see the vertebrae, okay, 12th and the first, well, in between the 12th and the 3rd lumbar vertebrae. And then you can see we do have floating ribs here that these kidneys are located behind. So you do have a little bit of protection by the 11th and 12th ribs that they do give a little bit of the, I guess, the superior region of the kidney protection. But there are some areas that are unprotected. Okay, so these areas are definitely unprotected by the vertebrae. Looking at a transverse section through, I just wanted you to see that retroperitoneally means they're behind the peritoneum. And if you look right here, here's the peritoneal membrane. Right here is the peritoneal membrane. They're not covered by the peritoneal membrane. Okay, the spleen is, but the kidneys are not. That's why we call them retroperitoneal. I like this particular diagram because it does show you all of the fat tissue that is packing in around the kidney. It also shows you this little bit of renal fascia, which is the connective tissue that anchors the kidney. It anchors it to the surrounding structures. Okay, so you can kind of see that. So they're not floating around, but they are anchored in place. So this is just a simple diagram showing you some of the external anatomy of the kidney. So there is an indented area called the renal hilum, and this is the entrance for the renal artery and the renal vein. So the renal artery is colored red here, and the renal vein is colored blue here. So of course you know that arteries carry blood into the organ and veins carry blood out of the organ. That hilum also has the ureter coming out. So you can see the ureter comes out of the hilum. And there would also be, not shown in this diagram, but there would also be nerves that are going into and servicing the kidney. Also lymphatic tissue as well, so you'd have lymph vessels coming into and out of the renal hilum. Okay, so if we kind of look more at, we kind of cut a kidney open and kind of look inside of it, we're going to find that there's two distinct regions. There's going to be a renal cortex, that's kind of an outer region, and then there's going to be a renal medulla, or a more inner region. The renal cortex will contain these workhorses of the kidney called nephrons. Each kidney has about 1.25 million nephrons, so there are lots and lots of nephrons in each kidney. These nephrons are the functional unit of the kidney. They're the workhorses of the kidney. They're the ones that are going to be doing the filtering of blood, or at least plasma of blood that comes into them. The renal medulla houses tubes which collect and carry urine to the papilla. I'll show you the papilla in just a second, and then to the calyces, and I'll show you what those look like in just one second with a series of diagrams. Okay, now here's the simple view of the kidney, and then we'll look at a little bit more complex view. But this gives you a sense of kind of the organization of it. So the most outer skin of the kidney is going to be that fibrous capsule. It is a connective tissue. And then going inside, we have the renal cortex. So you can see they've kind of outlined it here for you to see. This little section right here is called the renal cortex. And if you do a dissection of this, you can see pretty easily the distinguishing area between the cortex and the medulla. So if we look at the renal medulla, here they're kind of this reddish shaped here, and they're kind of reddish color there, and they're shaped kind of like pyramids to a degree. In between the renal medulla, each of the renal pyramids, there is a renal column. So you can see the little column of material that goes down, and then there, and of course these little structures right here are the renal pyramids. So they're part of the medulla. There are these little collecting slots, I guess you could call them, called calyces. And there are smaller calyces, and then there are bigger calyces. So we have minor calyces and major calyces. These are going to be structures that are going to collect the urine, that drips out of the renal papilla, which is right here. Notice here's a nephron. This little structure right here is a, let me ink that out. Let me show you exactly. So this is a nephron right here, and then this little tube right here is collecting duct. So whatever urine is made by these nephrons is eventually going to run into these minor calyces, and then into major calyces, and eventually to the renal pelvis. So all of these juices, all of this urine is going to be dripping and collecting in this renal pelvis, and then it eventually goes out of the ureters and that takes it down to the urinary bladder. Okay. Here's a more specific diagram of the kidney. So here we have the renal cortex, we have the renal medulla. Okay, so those are pretty easy, distinctive parts to see. In between the medulla parts, the actual pyramids, there are renal columns. So notice there's a column of tissue right here. But in between the columns, there's going to be these renal pyramids. So these are pyramids there. So at the end of the pyramid, there's going to be the papilla, the renal papilla. And the papilla will be, a collection of all of these collecting ducts collecting urine. So all of those things are going to drain to the papilla and eventually drain or drip out into this calyx here. So we do have a minor calyx. So a minor calyx is basically draining all of the urine from one papilla. Major calyx is going to be draining the minor calyces. So multiple minor calyces will be dripping urine into the major calyx. And then, of course, all of these calyces will drop urine into the renal pelvis, and then it'll all drip out of the ureter. Okay, I think I've covered all that. We do have that fibrous capsule, and so this is called a kidney lobe. It's all the stuff that's in between two of those renal columns. Okay, so I think I've covered the renal pyramid, so I think everything is covered that you need to know. Alright, so if we take a look at the gross structure of the kidney, the whole structure of the kidney, you can see what it looks like. But what I like the artist has done here is they've taken a little picture through some of the cortex and through one of the renal pyramids to allow you to see a little bit more of the more microscopic structure of it. So you can see that here's the renal cortex, here's the renal medulla. So there are these structures called nephrons. Remember, there's a million of them plus in each kidney, and so they're located partly in the cortex and then partly in the medulla, and all of the collecting ducts, which are these longer yellow tubes right here, are going to be found also in the cortex and the medulla. Okay, and that carries urine down to this minor calyx here. I like the artist. They've taken out one nephron and just shown you what it looks like, and it's also known as a so nephron is the structure there, and so we'll now look at some of the structures of nephrons in just a minute. Let me talk about the blood vessels here, the renal blood vessels, just for a second. There is a very specific circulation that occurs in the kidney. So we've looked at the abdominal aorta in one of the first pictures we looked at the abdominal aorta. It's going to give rise to branches off of itself, and those are going to be the renal arteries. Those renal arteries will carry a lot of blood to the kidneys. Okay, although the kidneys constitute less than 0.5% of the total body mass, they receive at any given time 20 to 25% of the resting cardiac output. So we're talking huge quantities of blood going to the kidneys. This is probably why you don't want to be stabbed in a kidney or have blood leaking from a kidney, because there's a lot of blood that goes to it. As the renal arteries pass into the kidneys, they're going to branch into successively smaller and smaller arteries. We'll look at that kind of like a flow chart of that in just a second. And then after that blood's been taken to where it needs to go, the venous blood will be returned through a series of small venules and then bigger veins, and they basically will correspond to the arterial pathway and have very similar names to the arterial names. Blood will exit through the renal veins. Okay, here's a flow chart of kind of how that's going to work. So coming off the abdominal aorta, we have the renal artery. That renal artery will begin to branch into smaller and smaller arteries. The first artery it branches into is the segmental artery. Segmental arteries will branch into or flow into the interlobular arteries. So those are arteries in the interlobal area or in the column area, the renal column area. And then these are going to branch into arcuate arteries and then cortical radiate arteries, and then they'll branch into the smallest of the arteries, the afferent arteriole, will enter into the nephron. Again, I'm kind of outlining just a flow chart here for you, and we'll kind of look at this more specifically in some diagrams so you get a sense of what this is looking like. So the first part of the nephron is going to be called the glomerulus. And there is this afferent arteriole that flows into it. So if you looked at the glomerulus, it kind of looks like something like this. So here's what a glomerulus looks like. And it's going to have an afferent arteriole that flows in. And then it's going to have a little ball. So this little ball of capillaries here, which is really hard to draw on this computer screen. But there's a little ball of capillaries that the afferent arteriole is going to make, and that is actually called the glomerulus. This is actually called the glomerular capsule. And so we have the afferent arteriole flowing into this little ball of capillaries, and then we have the efferent arteriole flowing out. So as blood is forced into this little ball of capillaries called the glomerulus, there's going to be fluids that are going to be squeezed out that are going to be filtered by the nephron. And we'll talk a lot more about that in just a few minutes. So we have an afferent coming in, we have an efferent coming out. So there's the efferent arteriole coming out. Then these efferent arterioles are going to branch into peritubular capillaries. These are going to be capillaries that wrap all around the nephron and help to reabsorb water from the nephron back into the body. So we then have venules that are formed after those peritubular capillaries do their job. We then have cortical radiate veins, arcuate veins, interlobular veins, and then the renal vein carries blood out. Okay, so we're talking about lots of blood flowing in, and blood's flowing in so that the nephron can do its job of helping to do all the jobs like maintain pH, maintain solute concentrations. The nephron is going to help the body do all those particular things. It's also going to help regulate osmolarity, blood volume, and those kinds of things. Okay, this is just kind of showing you a little bit more specific diagram, showing you those arteries and those veins we just talked about a little bit. Okay, so here we have the renal artery. This is where blood's going to be coming into the kidney. So it comes on through, so they're going to branch into segmental arteries. Those segmental arteries will keep on flowing up and flowing up until they hit the interlobular arteries. So they're going to actually go in between the lobes, these little interlobular arteries. Okay, they will then begin to branch into smaller and smaller arteries. So they will branch into the arcuate, that's not the arcuate arteries. That'll branch into the cortical radiate arteries, and eventually into smaller and smaller arteries, all the way to the glomerulus. They then will come out of the glomerulus, and they'll follow the same vein pattern back to the renal vein. Okay, so blood comes in, it goes to the nephrons, blood comes out, goes out to the vena cava. Here's a better diagram showing you once it's in the interlobular artery. So once it's in the interlobular artery, it goes to the arcuate artery. So we can see it kind of branching. So here's the interlobular artery. Then it branches into the arcuate, and then it's going to branch into the cortical radiate artery. Okay, and then it's going to go to the afferent arteriole, and then the glomerulus, and then it's going to come on back down through the veins. So we have the efferent arteriole, the cortical radiate veins, and then it comes on down to the interlobular vein, and then eventually flows out of the kidney. Okay, so that's just a little bit more specifically what it looks like as it's coming in. If you notice, this picture is kind of nice because it shows you, with not too much detail, it shows you a nephron. So here's a nephron here, which are the workhorses. Remember, there's more than 1 million of those per kidney. This is kind of nice because it's showing you the cortex. So here's the cortex, here's the medulla, and it's showing you that the nephron is found in both of those structures. So if we take a look at the glomerulus, that's the little ball of capillaries that forms from the afferent arteriole coming in. And so this little structure here called the nephron is the filtering unit. And we're going to look a lot more at how that particular structure works. If you notice in this diagram, the artist has done a pretty good job of showing you that there are two different kinds of nephrons. There's a cortical nephron right here, and most of it lies within the cortex of the kidney. And then there's a juxtamedullary nephron, and a great portion of that lies within the medulla. Okay, so there are different kinds of nephrons. We're not going to get into why there are that much. But it's just something you can see in this particular diagram. And I apologize if I show too many pictures, but I'm a very visual learner personally, so I like to look at lots of different pictures, lots of different angles, lots of different artist interpretations, and I draw from not just one text, but many texts, because I find the different pictures to be useful that different artists have done. So this is just showing you a little bit more or a different kind of detail of the nephron. So here we have a piece of the kidney has been sectioned out, showing you one nephron. This allows you to see the afferent arteriole going in. You can see the glomerulus, the little ball of capillaries. Then you can see the efferent arteriole going out. The reason I show you this particular picture because I want you to see the peritubular capillary bed. So that efferent arteriole that comes out of that glomerulus branches and branches and branches and wraps all around the nephron. I assume you can see that on your screen. But that efferent arteriole, once it comes out, it branches and then wraps all of these little capillary parts, wrap all around all parts of the nephron. And that's really key and critical. So, the job of the afferent arteriole and the glomerulus is to squeeze blood or plasma out of the bloodstream so they can go in these little tubes, these little nephron tubes. And when they're in these nephron tubes, that's where the nephron tube will filter things out. It'll keep some things like waste products in. So as all of that juices go all the way through, eventually there will be material that will be considered waste products that will be taken out. Now, you don't want to urinate everything that's in that tube out. You want to reabsorb water, you want to reabsorb salts, you want to reabsorb perhaps calcium, maybe you want to reabsorb bicarbonate. There's lots of things that you want to reabsorb. And when you reabsorb that back into the kidney, it can't stay in the kidney. It has to go into these blood vessels so that you can put it back in the plasma of your blood. If stuff just started to accumulate in your kidneys, perhaps your kidney would swell up, and that would not be good. But it wouldn't get to the bloodstream unless there's these capillaries that it can flow into. So we're going to talk about all the different little tube parts of the nephron and what they reabsorb and what their jobs are, and we'll do that in just a few minutes. Now, ultimately, you should be able to draw and label a nephron. I mean, that should be something that you have the ability to do. So it's not that hard of a structure to know. So I would encourage you to practice that on your own. So each kidney contains at least 1 million nephrons. Each of them consists of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule. The corpuscle is kind of like the catcher's mitt. It holds the glomerulus, and then the renal tube is going to weave back and forth to increase surface area. The renal corpuscle is the filtering portion of the nephron. It's made up of that little ball of capillaries that we've been talking about called the glomerulus. And there is a capsule around that called the glomerular capsule. And that receives the filtrate that's going to be squeezed out of the blood vessels. So once the blood or filtrate now has been squeezed out of the blood vessels, it's going to enter into a renal tubule, and this will branch away from the glomerular capsule. It's going to first become a very, very highly coiled proximal convoluted tubule. Now it's called proximal. It's the part of the tube that's closest to the glomerular capsule, so we call it proximal. And this leads to eventually a nephron loop, and then finally to a distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so PCT, proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, also known as the loop of Henle, and then DCT, distal convoluted tubule. Each of these parts of the nephron have a very specific job that they play in helping to reabsorb nutrients and ions and water, or secrete certain kinds of things too. These cells can actually pull things from the blood vessels, or the blood vessels that are wrapped around, and put them into the filtrate. So at the very end of a nephron, we have the distal convoluted tubules. Several of those are going to join to and become what we call the collecting duct, which will carry urine out of the kidney. Okay, so this is just showing you the two kinds of nephrons and kind of just giving you a little sense of some of the parts of this structure. So if we take a look at a cortical nephron, so we have the renal corpuscle, and then we have the renal tubule as the tubes there. The collecting duct's not considered to be officially part of the nephron, so at some point the nephron will just join with and form the collecting duct. So we do have the proximal convoluted tubule, where that little arrow is there. We have the nephron loop. We have the distal convoluted tubule. Each of those parts of the nephron are going to do a different job. If you notice, the cortical nephron is mostly in the cortex. The juxtamedullary nephron is going to be partially in the cortex and then partially in the medulla. It's got a much longer loop of Henle, or renal loop, than the cortical nephrons do. If you look at some animals, like say like kangaroo rats, they're going to have super long renal loops, or loop of Henle, and that helps them to reabsorb water much more efficiently, because those animals live in the desert. So you can section a kidney of an animal and look at the length of the renal loops and determine if it's a desert dwelling, or if it's not in an area that where they have to worry about water. All right, so here's a nice little picture that's drawn of the nephron. So this is getting, this is just a little different view of it. I think this is a little bit easier view to kind of see. So we do have the renal corpuscle made up of the glomerular capsule, and the little ball of capillaries is the glomerulus. We then have the proximal convoluted tubule. We then have the nephron loop, or the loop of Henle. There is a descending portion and an ascending portion. This thickness right here represents a change in the type of epithelium that makes up that tube. I'll talk about that in just a minute. We then have the distal convoluted distal convoluted tubule. Now, if you notice, these things are convoluted. They are twisted back and forth, and that is to increase the surface area, because there's going to be some very special things that happen in these particular parts. So if you take this very convoluted tube and stretch it, it is a tube. It's one continuous tube. So we do have a part that's going to be a filtration part. So up here, where you have the glomerular capsule and the glomerulus, that's where where plasma is going to be squeezed out of the blood to become filtrate. We then have the parts of that are going to be doing reabsorption. Parts of that tube will be doing reabsorption. Parts are going to be doing secretion. Parts are going so reabsorption is where you take stuff out of the tube and put it back into the bloodstream. Secretion is where you take stuff out of the bloodstream and put it into the tube. And then parts of the tube are going to be partly dealing with getting rid of the waste products. So that tube that you stretched out is going to have different jobs all along its length. Now notice too that the blood vessels are going to be all on the length of the tube as well. So you can have reabsorption and you can have secretion of materials. So these things are very intimately in contact with each other, and there's not a great distance between the capillaries and the actual tube. All right, well, let's show you some of the histology of this, and then we'll get into some of the more deep physiology of it, what each section does. All right, so let's start at the renal corpuscle. So let's start at the actual glomerular capsule. The glomerular capsule is made of simple squamous epithelial cells. It's not a thick tissue, but it does encompass or encapsulate all of that structure there, the afferent arteriole, the efferent arteriole, and the glomerulus. So there is a tube there, or a hollow sphere, that's created by the simple squamous cells that are there. Okay, so so moving from the renal corpuscle, we'll now move into the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule is going to have cells that are going to be making up the wall of that tubule. There are going to be cells that are going to be cuboidal. Now, the part that's in contact with the lumen, with the actual space inside the tube, they're going to have microvilli. Those microvilli are going to increase the surface area of those cells significantly, and they're going to aid in reabsorption of materials. So embedded on all of those little processes, those little microvilli, there's going to be all kinds of carrier proteins that are going to aid in the transport of materials from the cell to the filtrate, and from the filtrate to through the cell. There's lots of mitochondria, lots of Golgi apparatus, lots of rough endoplasmic reticulum inside the cells. They are protein machines. They're making tremendous numbers of proteins. They're very energetic. They have to have lots of ATP in order to do the job of reabsorbing materials, but also secreting materials into that tube. Okay, so that's the proximal convoluted tubule. Moving on down, so here's the proximal convoluted tubule. Moving on down, we're going to move into the descending loop of Henle. The descending loop of Henle is going to be made of simple squamous cells. Okay, and then we're going to have a portion of the ascending loop is also made of simple squamous cells. And then we have the ascending loop, this little portion right here, the ascending loop. This is going to be made of a cell that's kind of a low cuboidal. It's not a full-blown cuboidal, but it's not a squamous cell, so it's a little bit of a thicker cell. Now, these cells will differ in the proteins that are on their membranes. Some of them will have proteins that will allow water to move through them, and others of them will have proteins that are going to allow salt to move more easily through them, and not necessarily water. So they each have different jobs that they perform. So they do have differences all along the length. So if we move into the distal convoluted tubule, we're going to move into here the distal convoluted tubule. Cells there are going to be cuboidal, but they have very few of the microvilli. So a lot less secretion and absorption, reabsorption are going to occur in this distal convoluted tubule, but it's still going to do some absorption and secretion to help in the filtering process. Okay, so as I indicated to you before, all along the length of that nephron, there's going to be different jobs that are performed. For example, the job of the renal corpuscle is going to be filtration. That is the squeezing of plasma through that glomerulus and into the glomerular capsule. Okay, so that's the filtration part. Now, if you notice, there are blue arrows. Solid blue arrows mean like water reabsorption, and then solid orange arrows are going to mean solute reabsorption, so the bringing back in of perhaps sodium or chloride or potassium or other materials like that. Okay, so we can see that the proximal convoluted tubule is going to be doing some secretion, so some things are going to go into the filtrate, but it's going to be doing a lot of reabsorption of solutes and water. If we look at the nephron loop, the descending nephron loop is going to be doing water. Okay, so water will be coming out here too, in a little portion of the ascending. We get into full-blown ascending loop from here to here. Full-blown ascending loop is going to be reabsorbing solutes, especially salts. So if we get into the distal convoluted tubule, there's going to be some reabsorption of solutes and water and some secretion of materials into the filtrate. If we get over here to the collecting duct, there will be some secretion Some things are going to go into the tube, but there's going to be some reabsorption of things as well. Some reabsorption of solutes and not solutes, excuse me, but some reabsorption of various materials like sodium chloride and perhaps even a little urea, but then there will be lots of reabsorption of water. Okay, whatever makes it beyond that is going to be eliminated, so this will be taken out of the kidney to the urinary bladder for elimination. Alright, well, you know, your textbooks and things have some great charts in them. So, you know, just as kind of a little review, you do have the renal corpuscle, and histologically it's made of lots of different parts, but a simple squamous epithelium making up the wall of the capsule. And then you have simple squamous cells making up the walls of the glomerular capillaries. Okay, so you have a lot of things going on there. It's not very long. And its job is filtration of the plasma of the blood. So if we get down into the renal tubule and the proximal convoluted tubule, we have the cuboidal cells with microvilli. It's 14 millimeters long. So literally it's twisted all, you know, up. But if you stretch it out, it's 14 millimeters long. And it has a major job of reabsorption of ions, organic molecules, vitamins, sugars, little small amino acids that have worked their way into there, water, you know, and its job is to secrete, you know, toxins, drugs, and hydrogen ions, acids. So if we get into the nephron loop, there's a portion of it that's simple squamous, there's a portion of it that's low cuboidal, and it's really long, 30 millimeters long, and the descending loop is going to be reabsorption of water. Ascending loop is reabsorption of ions, specifically the salts, like sodium. And then we get into the distal convoluted tubule. We're going to get back into a cuboidal with few microvilli. It's about 5 millimeters long, so you know, the proximal convoluted tubule is much longer. I guess almost 3 times as long. And then reabsorption of sodium, calcium, secretion of acids, ammonia, drugs, toxins, are some of the jobs that the distal convoluted tubule does. So yeah, I mean, it's a really complex structure. I mean, you can see we've talked about all of these parts here. The artist has done a wonderful job of putting all these parts together for us to see. You can see the blood flow, you can see also the nephron. So it's just kind of a cool review of that. I do think it's important though that you know the flow of fluids through the nephron. So we have essentially the initial filtration. So into the capsule of the filtrate, we move through the proximal convoluted tubule, the descending loop of Henle, ascending loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and then eventually collecting duct. I like this picture because it shows you all the blood vessels that are wrapped around all the parts of the nephron so that reabsorption and secretion can occur. If you didn't have those blood vessels wrapped around there, you wouldn't have secretion and reabsorption of materials. So it's a really key important part to understand there. Okay, and you can go back and look at all the detail of that, but we've talked about it, and I don't want to keep boring you with all the detail. So moving on down through the collecting ducts, so you might have, you know, this might be a distal convoluted tubule that plugs in, another distal convoluted tubule, another distal convoluted tubule. So there's multiple distal convoluted tubules that will eventually flow into that collecting duct. So the collecting duct, at the very top of it or beginning of it, it's made of several different kinds of cells. These intercalated cells and then the principal cells. The intercalated cells are going to regulate acid-base balance. This is a really important part of the kidney, maintaining your proper pH of the bloodstream. And then principal cells are going to be involved in reabsorption of water back into the bloodstream and then secretion of potassium ions into the filtrate. You don't want too many potassium ions in your bloodstream. You have to regulate that, you know, so that you don't have problems with ionic imbalance. That could alter how your nerves and muscles work. If we get down to this papillary duct, this is leading down to the papilla, which is leading to the calyx. Well, we have a columnar epithelium that begins to form. So more of a protective epithelium. And again, the collecting duct has, the very beginning of it has cuboidal cells, 15 millimeters in length, and the reabsorption of water. and sodium ions and secretion of hydrogen ions or bicarbonate, depending upon the acid-base balance that needs to be established. We also will secrete potassium as well. So also we have the papillary duct is going to be columnar, and it's going to be about 5 millimeters long, and it's going to conduct fluids to the the waste products to the minor calyx. Sorry, my cat's over here distracting me. I'm petting her. Alright, so blood supplied to a nephron is going to be received by the glomerulus. So they receive blood from a fairly large afferent arteriole. So aft means coming in, eft means going out. So coming into this glomerulus is the afferent arteriole, and the diameter of it is actually larger than the efferent arteriole that's going out. So the efferent arteriole gives rise to those capillaries that wrap around all of the nephron parts and surrounds the renal tubule. And one last picture of that, showing you the afferent arteriole coming in to the glomerulus, which is the ball of capillaries, and the efferent arteriole going out, which then becomes all of these vessels that wrap around the nephron loop. My cat's usually not very nice, but she's being nice right now. Her name's Becky, if you're wondering. Okay, so we have afferent arteriole going in, glomerulus, filtrate being squeezed into the nephron. Then we have the efferent arteriole going out and becoming all of the capillaries that wrap around. Now this is what a nephron, a cortical nephron, it looks like. And the capillaries that wrap around it are actually called peritubular capillaries. This is what a juxtamedullary nephron looks like. Remember, a lot of it's in the medulla of the medulla of the kidney. And so it has a similar structure, an afferent arteriole, an efferent arteriole. Efferent arteriole, though, is going to become peritubular capillaries, and those peritubular capillaries will form this thing called the vasa recta, or vasa recta, which kind of wraps around all of the nephron loop. Alright, so when we say a ball of capillaries, it literally is a ball of capillaries. It's a lot of capillaries. So that afferent arteriole branches and branches into all these capillaries that you see. And this is an electron micrograph, scanning electron micrograph picture of that. That's really kind of cool looking. So artist rendition, you can see the afferent arteriole coming in. It branches and branches and branches, efferent arteriole going out. Here's your glomerular capsule made of the simple squamous epithelium. And it wraps around and makes a continuous tube or sphere around the glomerulus. Okay, you don't want leakage. You don't want leakage coming out this way. You have to keep that filtrate flowing in the right direction. So, if you notice the glomerular capillaries, they're not by themselves. That is, they have these little things called podocytes that are wrapped all around them. These podocytes are very sophisticated cells. If you notice, they are going to have these little foot processes which interdigitate with the other podocytes that are near them. And these these make what we call filtration slits. These are little spaces between the foot processes, and they're really super thin. They don't allow a lot of materials to move out of that capillary, as we'll look at in a series of diagrams. If you notice the capillary, the glomerular capillary, they are fenestrated capillaries. That means they have pores that are pretty big. They don't let blood cells out, but they will let out proteins, and they will let out materials like vitamins and nutrients, sugars, amino acids. Those can pass through those little pores. Okay, so we'll look at how the filtration occurs over a series of diagrams. I kind of like this diagram because it's a little bit different. It shows you the afferent arteriole. I like these little smooth muscled The smooth muscles wrapped around, little bands of smooth muscles are wrapped around that. So you can see the blood's flowing into the glomerular capillaries. So this shows you a little bit of an important structure right here. So here we have the afferent arteriole, the efferent arteriole, and here we have a piece of the distal convoluted tubule. And this is cut in a section so you can see inside of it. So there's this little triangular area that has what we call the juxtaglomerular complex, and it has many parts to it. I don't want to overwhelm you with detail, but there are cells there that will sense things like blood volume, and can actually produce enzymes like renin, which can regulate blood volume. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that complex a little bit later. So I like this particular diagram because the artist has shown you that the glomerular capsule is made of simple squamous epithelium, and it wraps around tightly so that juices don't flow out of that capsule. And that capsule is continuous. So notice that the capsule is continuous with these podocytes. So there's no space, but that allows things to leak out between the podocytes and the simple squamous epithelium making up the capsule. So those podocytes there, they interdigitate with each other, forming those filtration slits. So anything that slides out of those filtration slits is going to move into the proximal convoluted tubule, and it will become filtrate. Just one more diagram, just showing you a cross-sectional view, and this is showing you a cross-sectional view of the glomerular capillary and the podocytes. Okay, so here we can see the capillary wall. It's fenestrated. It has pores. There is a basement membrane, which is that blue structure wrapped around the capillary and is in between a capillary and a podocyte. We then have the foot processes, which create the filtration slits. Okay, and in between those we have these cells called glomerular mesangial cells, and these are going to actually be able to sense chemical composition of the bloodstream. Probably nothing more different you can see here, although I love the proximal convoluted tubule picture, which shows you the cuboidal cells with the microvilli over the surface of them. Okay, so we're going to have blood come in through the afferent arteriole. It's going to go into the glomerular capillaries. Filtrate's going to be squeezed out. Blood goes out of the efferent arteriole. Okay, so we do have fenestrated capillaries. You can see they're very, very porous, and they're going to allow just about anything out of the blood except for blood cells. So if there's some things like super big proteins, maybe they don't go through, platelets don't go through, blood cells don't go through, white blood cells don't go through. Okay, but there's a lot of stuff that does go through. Whatever goes through then has to make it through the basement membrane, also known as the basal lamina. So large proteins won't make it through that membrane, and they'll be taken back into the bloodstream. Okay, and then we have the podocytes making up these filtration slits. And in this picture, the filtration slits are looking like they're pretty wide, but they're not. They allow for only very small to medium-sized proteins to go through, but not large proteins. So they do block certain things from going through. Now, if you got some kind of major infection or disease where you're producing where your blood cells are being destroyed, or things are being destroyed in your body, tissues being destroyed, and all that stuff is in your bloodstream, that can be a problem for your kidney. That can actually cause kidney failure to eventually occur. And what I mean by kidney failure is that if you have a lot of things that are making it through these pores, they can actually block the filtration membrane and thus stop the filtering of waste products out of your bloodstream. That's a real problem. Now, if we go back to this cell right here, these intraglomerular mesangial cells, These cells can actually clean up debris in the filtration, these filtration slits and filtration membrane. So they have a role of doing that as well. Now notice that the afferent arteriole is larger in diameter than the efferent arteriole. Probably you understand that there's more blood coming in than going out, and that aids in creating a pressure that will allow filtrate to be squeezed out of the glomerular capillaries. So you have to create hydrostatic pressure, blood pressure, to squeeze the filtrate out. Okay, I think at this time I'm going to break here, and we'll continue on and talk about how urine's actually formed, and a little bit more specifically how nephrons work in the next lecture. So until then, I will see you next time.